At approximately 10 this morning local time, an Israeli drone struck a vehicle in southern Lebanese village. People inside were killed. Two journalists from the Beirut newspaper Al-Akhbar, Amal Khalil and the photojournalist Zainab Faraj, who have traveled to the strike site to report, were then targeted in a second strike on the building where they had taken shelter. Faraj was eventually extracted and taken to hospital in, according to Lebanese health officials, very serious condition. Khalil's body was recovered from the rubble hours later. Lebanon's Information Ministry and the Red Cross said Israeli fire continued while rescuers attempted to reach the site. In a separate strike this afternoon, 2 more people were killed in Lebanon. A further strike in Jabor, in West Bekaa region, some 70 kilometers from Beirut, killed 1 person and wounded 2 others through IDF denied striking that area. The Israeli military statement said it had struck a vehicle in southern Lebanon after identifying what it called an immediate threat linked to Hezbollah, acknowledged 2 journalists have been wounded, denied targeting the press, denied obstructing rescue efforts, and said the incident was under review. Lebanon's Prime Minister, speaking this evening, described the obstruction of rescue teams and the secondary targeting as, quote, described war crimes. The Committee to Protect Journalists has now documented at least 7 journalists killed in Lebanon since the Iran war began on February 28. Amal Khalil is the 4th media worker killed by Israeli strikes in Lebanon since March alone. The Lebanon ceasefire Donald Trump announced on April 16 is a 10-day truce. It expires this Sunday, April 26 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun said today that Beirut will seek an extension. Parliament Speaker of Lebanon, most senior Shia official, remains opposed to face-to-face negotiations with Israel, preferring the indirect channel. And tomorrow, Friday, the first ever direct talks between Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors are scheduled to open in Washington under U.S. mediation. Hezbollah's response today was operational. The group announced it had fired a drone at an Israeli military post in Bayada in response to Israeli ceasefire violations. This is the first Hezbollah strike since the April 16 truce took effect, and it ends the one-way character of the 10-day window. The French president announced yesterday a second French UNIFIL soldier has died from wounds sustained in an attack on April 18 that Paris blames on Hezbollah, a claim that the group denies. Meanwhile, Israeli ground divisions, 5 of them reportedly, remain between 8 and 10 kilometers inside Lebanese territory, with the Israeli paper reporting this week that the IDF is preparing plans to continue the ground occupation even after the Iran war concludes. Let's understand what is actually being negotiated tomorrow in Washington, because it is not what the headlines would say. The Lebanese-Israeli ambassador talks are not a peace negotiation. They are on the Israeli side, an effort to legalize an occupation they intend to continue. The IDF's operational plan, it envisages continued ground presence in south of Lebanon after the Iran war ends. The buffer zone framing, which Israeli officials have used repeatedly since March, is the diplomatic cover for a permanent forward line that runs in places 10 kilometers north of the internationally recognized border. Tomorrow's Washington meeting is, in effect, an attempt to convert a 10-day truce into a long-term active arrangement for a territory Israel does not legally hold. On the Lebanese side, the talks happen because Beirut has no alternative. The Lebanese armed forces cannot alone compel an Israeli withdrawal. UNIFIL has just taken French casualties. Hezbollah is wounded severely from the 13 months of war that preceded this ceasefire. Parliament Speaker Barry's preference for indirect talks have been overruled by the necessity of President Aoun's position, which is that without the Washington track, there is no American pressure on Israel. And without American pressure on Israel, the ground presence becomes permanent by default. Now, the connection to the Iran. It has said from the first day of the ceasefire on April 8, and it said it publicly and privately, that the Iran ceasefire and the Lebanese ceasefire are one ceasefire. Washington has said they are two. Tel Aviv has said they are two. The journalist question. Tonight, this is the main story, and it deserves a direct language. Amal Khalil was the 4th media worker killed by Israeli strikes in Lebanon since March. The IDF's denial that it targets journalists is contradicted according to CPJ documentation by a pattern, not an incident. to put today's events into the larger regional picture and to give us an honest read on where this conflict actually is going, we've been joined by Scott Lucas, who is professor of U.S. and international politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Looking at this threat spectrum, which is so enlarged, I'm talking about Iran and U.S. conflict at the moment, various analysts argue that the regional conflicts, once entangled across multiple fronts, rarely resolve on a single front. The Iran ceasefire holds at the cost of the Lebanese ceasefire. Is that where we are tonight, trading one pause for the collapse of another? And if so, who is keeping score in Washington of the net result?
I certainly think that you make a very good point here about the linkage between conflicts and realizing that this is really an uncontained war. You have mentioned not only Iran, not only Lebanon. We could actually talk, for example, about the effects that this conflict is having on Iraq, on Syria, on Yemen, and of course on the Gulf states with Iran's retaliation. But I think the fundamental, as I talk to you here on this Thursday, is that from the Iranian regime's perspective, they are not going to go reach an agreement with the Americans solely on the Iran issue. They will demand a halt, a lasting halt to Israel's attacks on Hezbollah. Now, I think because, of course, Israel already is inside southern Lebanon, the talks between Israel and Lebanon, those two governments, may end with an Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon, but at least the fighting would stop. If that is the case, that removes one of the issues in the U.S.-Iran talks. But I must hasten to add that even though that is dealt with, we still have fundamental issues which are directly about Iran. The nuclear issue, the ballistic missiles issue, and increasingly this question of the Strait of Hormuz and what its status will be if we do get a ceasefire beyond a couple of weeks.
How do you differentiate between the two? The seizure of the Iranian vessel, followed by the blockade, and then the Strait of Hormuz being blocked by Iranians. Where are we in terms of international law? Who is doing what? I mean, how do we differentiate between the two blockades?
Yeah, I can at least handle this one quite easily, which is that the U.S.-Israel war on Iran was not legal under any reading of international law because Iran did not pose an imminent threat to either country. So you start off with that fundamental illegality. Now, the Iranian regime is just trying to survive. And Straits of Hormuz is, along with the retaliation against the Gulf states, its most effective leverage against the United States. So yes, they then threaten shipping. That in itself violates international law fundamentally. But of course, the Iranians will say, well, we're just defending ourselves. Then, of course, you get the U.S. who says, well, because the Iranians are not allowing shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, we will blockade Iranian ports. That, again, because the war is illegal, that is illegal. But I have to be very honest with you here. We're really talking about international law and principle. In practice, both sides now are committed to trying to force the other one to back down. So they aren't thinking about this legally. They're thinking about it politically as well as militarily.
Right. It's a conundrum, to be honest. Like, it's an illegal war on both sides. The Washington ambassador talks tomorrow are being described as historic. The first direct Lebanese-Israeli engagement at that level since 1983, I suppose. But there are reports that the IDF intends to stay in the south of Lebanon regardless of the outcome. In your view, what is actually achievable in those talks? If they are already so hell-bent on staying in there and not getting out of there, what would that achieve in the first place?
I think you put your finger on a fundamental we need to emphasize, and that is, I've said from the start of this Israeli war on Lebanon, which was on March the 2nd, only 2 days after the war in Iran, that what the Netanyahu government was pursuing was an expansion of occupation. think of what has happened in Gaza with that 2 years of mass killing. Israel now occupies 53% of Gaza for the indefinite future.
True.
There is both the mission the Netanyahu government wants, which is a greater Israel, at some points even claiming parts of Syria and Iraq. There's a fundamental, the way they will portray it, which is they have to expand the occupation to defend themselves against Hamas and against Hezbollah. However you read that, where we are with the Israel-Lebanon talks is that the Israelis are going to set as a condition for ceasefire that they keep troops in this buffer zone. The problem for the Lebanese government, well, there's two problems. One is that the Lebanese government is relatively weak. It's relatively fractured.
True.
Especially if the U.S. continues to back Israel. So they don't have much leverage to push back against that Israeli occupation. The second problem, however, that unsettles the whole process is Hezbollah is not at the table. And I think there's a bigger question beyond this, which is I think Israel's going to demand that Hezbollah be disarmed and be disbanded. And I'm not sure the Lebanese government is still in a position where it can offer that. So as long as that issue remains beyond occupation, I think we're going to have a very fragile ceasefire at best.
True, because Iran has tied all kinds of negotiations with Lebanon, which is like quite a big parameter, to be honest. And Tel Aviv is not ready to listen. And Washington, I don't know whether they can make Netanyahu conform to what is being agreed in any ceasefire or not. That is another question. But are we looking at a conflict which is truly ideological driven or personalities driven? What's going on? Because we no more see Congress backing this war, for sure. And the polls are against President Trump. Netanyahu is going into an election cycle next year. Are we looking at personalities who are weaponizing this conflict for their own political survival?
You're looking at all of this. I mean, you are looking at personal influences here. The fact that, and I just need to be honest with your viewers, Donald Trump is not stable. He's chaotic at best. He doesn't really understand the situation. So I think you have to look beyond him to other individuals in the Trump administration, which is divided over continuing this war. I think especially Vice President J.D. Vance has always been against it. Yeah. But then you have to look at the Israeli, a big motive behind the Gaza war, and now expanding this into Lebanon and attacking Iran is that, the moment these wars stop, Benjamin Netanyahu faces an uncertain political future if he cannot get victory, and he faces an uncertain legal future because of the trial and bribery charges. Then, of course, you have personalities within Iran who have spent decades seeing the United States as the major enemy. But I can give you all of that. We could talk about the economic dimensions, including oil.
Yeah.
We could talk about, the various ideological dimensions. There is an element of Christian nationalism in the Trump administration.
True.
Versus the Islamic Republic's ideology. But the fundamental here is its power, right? The Iranian regime is desperately trying to hold on to power. The United States is trying to establish dominance, because remember that just before this war, what did we have? We had the U.S. saying in a national security strategy it needed to have dominance in the Western Hemisphere. It needed to have dominance over Europe. It needed to have dominance in the Middle East. And what did it do to get dominance in the Western Hemisphere? It pursued regime change, or at least regime surrender in Venezuela. Having succeeded there, 2 months later, they think, well, maybe we can get regime surrender in Iran. That will show that more than 20 years after the failure of the U.S. with the Iraq War of 2003, they've come back to this idea of we are the superpower in the region.
Yes.
But just like Iraq did not end up that way, I don't think the Iran war ends up that way as well. In fact, I think the U.S. weakens itself rather than strengthens itself because of this misguided move away from negotiations and then pursuing the war alongside the Israelis.
I mean, Iran's very survival is dependent on its asymmetry. And one of the things that is on the table to be discussed is that it gives up Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis all together and just stop interfering in Gulf the way it is. Do you think that's going to happen? Just like Strait of Hormuz, my question always is that is the biggest leverage that Iran has at the moment. Unless you give Iran major concessions, why would Iran agree to any of these?
Well, I don't think Iran agrees to break its links with those groups just because that's sort of fundamental to its mission, almost to its identity.
Yeah.
Think about the whole, the axis of resistance that they try to project. But I actually look at, Iran had been significantly weakened in that regional position since 2023. Hezbollah had been decimated in Lebanon during the war on Gaza. You had the Assad regime, which fell in Syria at the end of 2024. The Houthis lost quite a few of their leadership through Israeli assassinations last year.
Absolutely.
And then, the Iran-backed militias, of course, have had to pull out of Syria. And in Iraq, they have a very complicated existence within the Iraqi armed forces. So, the idea that Iran was like this regional power that was on the up and up, that was taken apart. When, of course, you also add, I think, a key event, which was the assassination of General Soleimani in 2020. Mm-hmm. So what I think is curious is if you want to look at this from the aspect of regional power, why did you need to go to war with the Iranian regime? Why did you need to do that? Syria already is a very, very different country and pursuing a very interesting path. Lebanon is very, very fractured, very, very weak, but Hezbollah is definitely not running the country. And, if anything, what you've done is you've given the Iranian regime a lifeline.
True.
Because what they can do throughout the region is say, we're the victims. We're the victims.
Correct me, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong. You've given a lifeline to the hardliners in Iran, in my opinion, the IRGC, because those are the ones in control of most of the things over there.
I would still start with the idea this is still a theocratic system. So you still have to look, even if the supreme leader is incapacitated because of injuries on February 28th, even if his father was killed, you still have clerics who are there in the supreme leader's office. That is part of a system which also includes the military, the Revolutionary Guards, but remember, it also includes the government. And you do have to realize we have a foreign minister in Abbas Araghchi you look at. We do have a president in President Pezeshkian, and we do have an influential parliament speaker in Mohammed Bakr Halabaf.
Yeah.
When I first started learning about Iran more than 20 years ago, I had an Iranian colleague say, look, explain the Iranian system to me. He went for 3 hours and still hadn't completed the explanation. It is a very complex system with a link between the clerics, the military,
some
the
call
politicians.
it mosaic doctrine. They have prepared for it for 40 years. It is so disconnected from each other. It is very complex.
Yeah, it's very complex. But what it means is that when the Americans come out, and they've been running this in the past few days because they were very unsettled that the Iranians turned down the negotiations in Islamabad this week. They've been saying, oh, this is because of a fundamental division between the Revolutionary Guards and the foreign minister, and they're screaming at each other, et cetera. And I'm like, no, that's probably disinformation. Because even if there's slight differences on tactics between elements of the regime, they're united on what they want to do. They want to survive. They want to survive as a system.
Yeah. Scott Lucas, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you on our show tonight. So a ceasefire in Iran held together by a blockade that undermines it. A ceasefire in Lebanon held together by a truce Israel is already breaking. A mediator in Islamabad doing the work 3 superpowers declined to do. And tomorrow in Washington, an ambassador meeting that will either open a door or confirm that the door was never really open. And above all of it, our third story tonight, a constraint neither side has publicly acknowledged, but which every capital in this region now knows about. After the break.